Liberalism, international organization. You can see here on the left a very short list of international organizations and regimes that have ceased to exist. The list of existing international organizations and regimes is very long and can be seen on Wikipedia. There are a great many international organizations in the international system with differing levels of membership, effectiveness, and longevity. You can see in the top map a number of economic organizations like NAFTA, the European Union, ASEAN, Mercosur, that administer trade, particularly encouraging free trade. You can see in the bottom map more regional dialogue organizations like the African Union, the Organization of American States, and the Council of Europe. Liberalism, as applied to international institutions, is linked in the 19th century to a set of notions on the relationship between trade, domestic freedom, and peace. Following the explanatory challenge of realism, liberalism has adopted many of the same microeconomic assumptions of neorealism and has since become neoliberal institutionalism, meaning the new liberals who focus particularly on international economic institutions or organizations. Take note that military alliances with their own independent secretariat, like NATO, are typically better explained and predicted by neoliberal institutional theories than by realist theories that focus on alliance power. So let's take a look now, contrasting neorealism with neoliberalism. So let's revisit the implications of the realist assumptions. Number one, realists believe that cooperation is very difficult because states are driven by fear of each other's power, and because today's friend can become tomorrow's enemy. Intentions change. Leaders are voted out and replaced. Number two, since only states matter, international organizations do not matter. So as an elaboration, the strength, size, number, and purpose of international organizations for realists is determined by the distribution of power among the states. So if you want to know what an institution is going to do, just look at the most powerful member. The implication is that institutions only reflect the state and have no independent status. Number three, relative gains matter. Because the struggle for survival is a zero-sum game, in which A's gain is B's loss and B's gain is A's loss, therefore, you have to ensure your opponent does not get ahead of you. This implies it's better to be poor and ahead than behind and rich. So realists are defensive positionalists. The leaders of the countries care what ranking they have, and they're constantly afraid of elimination. This is captured by Catherine of Great Russia's famous quote, "Qui ne gagne rien perd." If you're not growing, you're shrinking. Liberal institutionalists emphasize the role of institutions in international cooperation. It has three major assumptions. Number one, anarchy can be mitigated by institutions facilitating cooperation. Two, international institutions are independent actors that can compete with states. Three, states are not the most important actors in the international system. Institutions also matter and have a large role. The implications of the liberal institutionalist assumptions are as follows. 1. Cooperation is not easy, but international organizations can facilitate it. 2. Survival is not the main preoccupation of states. States seek absolute gains. In other words, they prefer to be rich and behind than ahead and poor. This is termed rational egoists. Here, the main problem is not being knocked down in ranking. The main problem is avoiding cheating. To understand how institutions can make a difference to facilitate cooperation, as alleged by neoliberal institutionalism, let us look at the various techniques to facilitate cooperation. Two sources of disagreements can make cooperation difficult. The first is preferences over goals, what to get. And secondly, preferences over strategies, or how to get there. So let's look first at the preferences over goals. Participation in institutions may alter the interests and the goals of states by demonstrating with new information that the state was earlier misinformed about what it thought were its actual interests. Now there's an important note here. States never embark into an organization with the intention of having their goals, let alone their identities, changed. In fact, states resist this. The change of goals and identities that occur as a result of regional organizations tend to be unintended consequences. But this is precisely the phenomenon that is well explained in the European Union. None of the states that joined the European Union did it with the long-term intention of being absorbed by a superstate organization. They all joined in order to solve immediate problems, and in the process had their interests changed. That has now led to steps that were not originally anticipated. According to realism, states are not supposed to get on a path where they cease to exist. So liberal institutionalism does a much better job of explaining European integration. So let us now focus on strategies of cooperation. These are techniques to achieve the goal of cooperation. Number one, the institution can reduce transaction costs. A transaction cost is the cost and risks associated with carrying out an agreement. And it can do this by providing coordination information, much like you'd get from a tourist information booth. When two states show up, this acts like a coordinating agency. This saves time and money. So you have a group of specialists at this organization, and whatever the technical or interactional issue, they're specialized at making it go faster and providing solutions. Number two, in order to reduce the risk and damage inflicted by a defection from an agreement, the institution can break large transactions down, this is called decomposition, into smaller units. Or it can break the interaction and spread it out over time. Now this is obvious. Instead of trading 10 million barrels of oil at once for a suitcase of $1 billion, you can actually break it down into smaller units. You could trade 1 barrel for $1. This way, if one side defects or cheats by running away with the oil or the money, they at most get 1 barrel of oil or $1. They don't steal the entire suitcase and the entire ship. You are in effect reducing the gains to be made from exploitation, thereby reducing the incentive to exploit. In terms of international interaction, it would be for an institution to coordinate multiple different interactions between two states to help them achieve whatever their cooperation goal is, whether it's to negotiate a frontier agreement or manage trade agreements. It basically increases the confidence by breaking large interactions down that neither side will be taken advantage of. Number three, institutions can increase transparency. In arms control, this means having some method of verification. If each side can see the internal mechanics of the other's behavior, they'll be more reassured that they are not being cheated. and are therefore less likely to leave an agreement through fear of being exploited. Institutions can manage issue linkage. If over a given issue the distribution of benefits is not apparently fair, then one of the states can make a side payment to the other state in another issue area. For example, Saudi Arabia's enormous trade balance with the US in the oil trade in the 1970s led the Saudis to compensate by promising to buy large quantities of expensive US equipment. Number 5. Institutions can help states make commitments through sunk costs, which are the equivalent of hostages. In this sense, the hostage is the reputation of the state. You've invested time and the reputation into a cooperative agreement, and leaving or rearranging the interaction will impose additional public costs. So it's a way of publicly announcing your commitment. Number 6. Institutions can facilitate cooperation by making the threat of retaliation to a defection explicit. In other words, if you cheat, the punishment will be very clear. This would typically be achieved by describing the norms expected of states involved in an interaction and the punishment of a transgression, such as the loss of the opportunity of interacting through the same forum. Number 7. Institutions can foster the creation of reciprocity, that is, a strategy of interaction that builds upon A, the opponent's past behavior, and B, the promises of future gains, which are also called the shadow of the future. Both of these techniques rely on iteration, that is, the repeated playing of the game without a defined end. In other words, an expectation of an infinite number of turns. This was analyzed by Robert Axelrod in his book The Evolution of Cooperation, which looked at the tit-for-tat strategy in a prisoner's dilemma competition. You can imagine that the Silk Road that linked merchants between China and the customers in Europe was operating in complete anarchy. There was no overarching authority. There was, however, a learned pattern of behavior that maximized efficiency along the Silk Route that merchants needed to abide by in order for the system to work and remain cost effective. And this was achieved through reciprocity, by looking at individual merchants who probably didn't meet each other more often than once every, say, 5 years. And so reputations mattered enormously. And this very difficult trade route was kept operating because of the promise of future gains. A very important international regime that has come to influence subsequent regimes in the 20th and 21st century is the 19th century Concert of Europe. Here you can see the map of Europe immediately after the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte, the leader of France, and the organization of a new international institution to keep the peace. The Concert of Europe was founded after the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon's attempt to seize the control of Europe. This was the world's most expensive war to date, both in financial terms and in the nationalist social forces that it unleashed. Following the French Revolution, France's new source of legitimacy was not its sovereign, but its ethno-linguistic identity, its nationalism. Napoleon's opponents were largely sovereigns, that's to say monarchs, and Napoleon supported nationalist forces in many parts of Europe to undermine the strength of his monarchical opponents, largely through the sponsorship of local revolutions. With the war concluded in 1815, there was a general consensus that revolution was disruptive. The traditional monarchical states, such as Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary, were fearful of nationalist rebellions. Austria-Hungary, which was a multi-ethnic empire, was especially sensitive to this threat. Ultimately, all of these states would succumb a century later during the First World War to precisely these nationalist threats. The more independent societies, including England and France, were less concerned with domestic rebellion than with the effects of domestic rebellion abroad, since they tended to lead to despotism that led to war. You can see on the top right the diplomat Hardenberg of Prussia, who was one of a collection of ambassadors that were the architects of the 19th century concert of Europe. You can see at the bottom a portrait of Napoleon and some French nationalists. The concert of Europe's principal purpose was therefore to limit the likelihood of revolution, mainly through cooperation and the promise of not sponsoring revolutionaries in other states' societies. The Concert of Europe consisted of permanent embassies throughout Europe, but principally in Vienna, where state actions were planned with consideration as to the interest of the other states in the system, and through the use of close consultation. Its members were England, Russia, Prussia, Austria-Hungary, and even included defeated France. The arrangement of close consultations lasted until 1823. That's a period of 8 years. But the general agreement not to export revolution lasted until the Crimean War in 1853, during which England and France assisted the Ottoman Empire in fighting Russia. But even then, this agreement was partially responsible for the long peace. The peace that lasted from 1815, the defeat of Napoleon, to 1914, the beginning of the First World War. This was a 99-year period in which there was no world war. It was an unprecedented period of peace that allowed Europe to develop economically. You can see on the bottom right a portrait of some of the negotiators in the Concert of Europe, and you can see on the top right a depiction of the strategic situation during the Crimean War, which basically severely weakened the Concert of Europe. The Concert of Europe manifested itself as interstate cooperation to suppress uprisings, rebellions, and revolutions. And you can see in the maps on the top the various revolts that occurred after the Napoleonic Wars throughout Europe. These were normal rebellions that are associated with modernization, migration from the countryside into the cities, the spread of literacy that fed nationalism. In the bottom, you can see Hungarian revolutionaries who fought against the Austrians. And this is the remarkable thing about the Concert of Europe. When Hungarian revolutionaries were threatening to spread disruption within Austria's empire, the Russian army was sent into Budapest in 1948 to suppress the Hungarians on behalf of the Austrians, and then the Russian army went home. In other words, the major powers were sending armies into each other's territory to help each other to suppress rebellions, where during the time of Napoleon, they would have taken advantage of each other. But the Concert of Europe had a new norm, and that was a norm against revolution. The Concert of Europe collapsed because of the problem of relative gains. Essentially, suspicions of the states were heightened because the English and French, for example, thought that the Russians, Austrians, and Germans were using the concert as an excuse to stop domestic reform, where the press in England and France, which were more liberal, didn't want the English and French governments to stop liberal reforms abroad, because the English and French, their normative ideals were for democracy. So ultimately, the fear of differences in gains, relative gains, led to a collapse of the principle of revolutionary non-interference. States no longer trusted each other. And ultimately, the concert of Europe collapsed. In the center, you can see the map showing the Crimean War, which involved the Russians against the Ottoman, the English, and the French. And on the bottom right, you can see Frederick William III of Prussia, who was one of the negotiators at the concert of Europe. Robert Jervis identified 4 requirements for the existence of a concert. Number 1, all the members must be status quo powers. If there's a single revisionist power, the whole system will collapse. Number 2, the members must believe that the other members share a common value. For the concert, it was the principle of non-interference. Number 3, there must be no belief that the status quo can only be defended through expansion. In other words, there can't be an offensive advantage in the environment. And 4, war must be seen as costly, not profitable. So occupying foreign territories and extracting goods from it should not be seen as easy. You can see at the bottom right a young Leo Tolstoy, who was an artillery officer in Sevastopol during the Crimean War. So he effectively witnessed the end of the concert of Europe, and of course he's the author of War and Peace. Collective security. We often hear of this form of international cooperation as a means to avoid war. NATO refers to collective security as its principle. But this is false. NATO is a war alliance, and its self-identification as a collective security organization is designed to calm domestic aversion. So what's the definition of collective security? It's a security system wherein states collectively agree to peacefully regulate their behaviors and to permit change peacefully. The reason NATO is not a collective security organization is that it would have had to include the Warsaw Pact also. If NATO and the Warsaw Pact cooperated on managing their security issues, then you would have a collective security organization. But NATO and the Warsaw Pact are opposing wartime alliances. The purpose of collective security is the prevention of war by redefining state interaction peacefully. The legalistic regulation of behavior is intended to overcome the anarchy of the international system, thereby reducing the incentive to go to war. Here you can see the British Prime Minister George Canning, Foreign Prime Minister George Canning, or Foreign Minister rather. He was another negotiator in the preceding concert of Europe. Collective security has 3 components. Number 1, states must trust each other and renounce aggression. An example of this is the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which was an international agreement signed by most of the states in the world at the time, including Canada, that renounced war. Number 2, states must not act solely on self-interest, but think of the effect of their policies. Number 3, the states need to deal with transgressors collectively. On the top right, you can see the English negotiator Castlereagh, who was one of the more important members of the Concert of Europe. Now, collective security has a number of logical flaws. 1, it does not address the effects of the security dilemma. 2, states do not trust each other and therefore cannot act collectively because of a number of causes. A, it's impossible to distinguish between an aggressor and a victim, and therefore who is the actual transgressor. B, it's impossible to distinguish between good and bad aggression. C, states would be reluctant to punish a friendly transgressor. At the top here you can see Talleyrand of France, a very important diplomat who served both Napoleon and the post-Napoleonic royal regime of France. D. Relative gains and burden sharing will weaken collective action. E. The slow reaction of the community of states will encourage fait accompli attacks. F. States will resist cooperating as it constitutes a threat to state sovereignty. G. Attitudes to the use of force will inhibit responsible states to help threaten states. Here you can see Tsar Alexander I of Russia, one of the key architects of the Concert of Europe. In reality, the collective security system only seems to work against smaller states when the great powers are in consensus, which tends only to occur in the period immediately after a hegemonic war. There are also domestic legal dysfunctions, which happens every time lawyers rather than political scientists seize control of national diplomacy. Typically in periods when the war is over and military considerations are not important, lawyers will create regimes that are effectively unrealistic and based on legalist principles. For example, Woodrow Wilson sought a form of collective security to replace the dangerous and war-prone balance of power system in place in Europe. And this is the principle that typified the League of Nations and the United Nations, although the UN does a better job of procedurally implementing the differences between the smaller and the greater powers. Now, the collective security has its formal origins in the Concert of Europe that was negotiated in Vienna at the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars. And so, in some sense, the attempt at collective security after the First World War was an attempt, although desperately unsuccessful, to extend that long period of peace. Now you can see here the situation immediately after the First World War, including the founding states of the League of Nations, which are in orange, and the light orange states that were admitted to the League of Nations after 1920, and the states in yellow that were admitted later on. And you can see that some states were expelled, like the USSR. So the League of Nations was founded as a form of collective security at the conclusion of the First World War, but failed because there was a profound sense of disagreement between the weak status quo powers, like England and France, and the powerful revisionist states in the form of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy, and a large number of smaller states. So what are the statistical findings? Norms, which are a byproduct of a successful collective security system that manages to alter expectations and legitimate behavior in the international system, fluctuate in their effect on peace. During the Concert of Europe from 1816 to 1848, the period was generally peaceful, and the Bismarckian period from 1849 to 1870 was less peaceful. Both periods had the same number of disputes, but 4 of these in the Bismarckian period escalated all the way to war. So let's take a look now at the European Union. And here you can see the early European economic community as it was organized. The original members of the European Union were Belgium, France, the German Federal Republic, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. In 1973, Denmark, the United Kingdom, and Ireland joined. In 1981, Greece joined. In 1986, Portugal and Spain joined. And in 1995, Austria, Finland, and Sweden joined. And then a slew of countries have followed since. The idea of European integration has its origins in how the French were to manage Germany, a state larger and wealthier, but also geographically more insecure, The American push for European integration was to create a Europe wealthy enough to pay for its own defense against the Soviet Union in Central and Eastern Europe. The first attempt at European integration was called federalism in the late 1940s and was based on the idealism of the 1930s. It required that the European states pool their economic and defense resources with the economic levers, such as banking, controlled centrally. It was simply too far, too fast. And with the failure of the EDC, the European Defense Community, in the French Parliament in 1954, it failed too. It had been also opposed by the US, which sought to establish NATO at the same time. An alternate path focused on functionalism. And this was led by David Mitrani, who you can see at the bottom left. And this focused on the short-term economic benefits of cooperation through regional organizations. Functionalism was picked up as a feasible strategy by Jean Monnet, who is in the bottom. He was an integrationist. He essentially sought a common foreign policy for Europe. Monnet's plan was picked up by the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman, who's on the bottom right. And this was called the Schuman Plan in 1950. It led to the success of the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC, between France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, that coordinated coal and steel production to ensure no mass unemployment or economic shocks, and to obtain control of such militarily significant resources as coal. From the same monetism, there followed the European Economic Community and the European Atomic Energy Community, Euratom, in 1958. You can see here there's a coal concentration on the Belgian and French border and in the Saar, which is located on the German-French border area. And these areas don't seem substantial, except that there was a very large employment of miners in these regions, and suddenly shutting down the mines would cause dislocations in the countries and give an incentive for one country to dump cheap coal on another country's market. And so the Coal Commission essentially coordinated the downsizing of the mines and took away the incentive by either government to play popular politics with the miners' unions. European integration stalled in the 1970s following the economic slowdown, particularly the trigger of the 1973-1974 oil crisis and the rising competition from Japan. But by 1985, it picked up again in the form of intergovernmentalism, when it became clear that the effects of globalization increasingly made individual states vulnerable to capital flows and other economic effects. The Single European Act, ratified in 1987, aimed at a common market, and plans for an EMU, the European Monetary Union, were revived in 1988. The TEU, the Treaty on the European Union, the Maastricht Treaty, was adopted in 1991 and ratified in 1993. As a consequence, elections to the European Parliament every 5 years since 1979 for 626 seats were coupled with continuing governmental appointments to the intergovernmental bodies, such as the European Commission. While there was no long-term goal to destroy the individual European states, the process of interaction through the EEC and the European Union managed to alter the identities and consequent interests of the individual states.